So we're going to take a moment to talk about evaluating scientific learning. As teachers, a lot of our job comes down to evaluating scientific learning, looking at what's there, what students have done, and giving them some feedback on that. Now, an important point is, although most of the time when we talk about evaluating learning, we call it grading. But evaluation is the point that Elliot Eisner made, that evaluation doesn't necessarily mean the giving of a grade, right? It means looking at what a student's done and recognizing what's of value. One of the things that always disappointed me as a secondary science teacher is when I would have a junior high or high school student come in and say, I'm not good at science. Because science takes so many different forms that it's really not possible for someone to not be good at it in any regard. Now, I think what they really meant was, I've not done well in science classes, or I've not earned good science grades in the past. But that's not the same thing as not being good at science. And I think what's happened is they've received some feedback of, you're wrong, you're incorrect. And that's not useful feedback in helping students become better science learners. Now, that's not saying you don't correct them, that everyone gets good grades and that's the answer. But we want to evaluate and correct them in a way that moves them forward. So when it comes to evaluating scientific learning, things you want to be sure you do is to recognize the strengths and weaknesses. So in an activity, if a student's writing up to describe it, or they've made a post or whatever, there are going to be strengths and weaknesses. Some students are incredibly good at describing their observations, right? They are very good at describing what they saw. Maybe it's drawings, so maybe you did something like the seed dissection, and their drawings were just super detailed and really showed it very well. Wonderful. That's a great strength. Some students, their strength is that they get to really great conclusions from their evidence, and so they're able to really pull in a lot of different sources of information, or maybe they're really perceptive and they notice some small details and that shows through in their conclusion. Great. Some students, their real strength is that they are very detailed in how they describe the background information of what they did. So if it was an inquiry activity where they were describing their own background information, some of them are really great at describing that. So you're recognizing what they did well and using that as a place to build and move forward, right? Because there's going to be things that can be improved. There's always things that can be improved. Career scientists working on this campus have things that can be improved. I have things in my research that can be improved. That's just the nature of science. So the goal is that we want to start from strengths and say, hey, here's things that were really great. I really love the detail in your drawings. I really love the detail in your observations. Why don't you use more of that in your conclusion to help support your conclusion? So in your conclusion, maybe your conclusion was a little weak. What if you use some of these details from your observations to help strengthen it? Right, that's a very obvious step forward. So you want to point out strengths. You want to deal with weaknesses. That means knowing students individually, knowing them well, and knowing how to push them forward. So when it comes to pushing a student forward, a lot of that depends on the students themselves. If it's a student that is pretty thick-skinned, maybe one that typically gets good grades, pretty thick-skinned, there's a place to say, hey, this just really isn't up to what you're capable of. And I really think you can do more. And that's fine. For other students, they may take it very personally. And as you're giving feedback, you're being their cheerleader as much as you're being their evaluator. And, so maybe it sounds something like, hey, I really love how you did this. I think you could build on it here. I know you can really end up with something super incredible here. I can't wait to see that. And you really have to build them up in it. So that depends on the student, and you're going to have to know the student to do that. So again, things to look for: address the strengths and weaknesses, give ideas to help push their thinking forward. So maybe that's follow-up questions. So maybe they have an explanation for why they think the particular phenomenon happened, and you have to kind of push them forward with what else could have caused this? What if you would have had, with the seed dissecting, what if you would have had more seeds? What do you think some of your limitations could have been? Questions like that to help push them forward. Then ultimately, you have to make sure it's appropriate to the students, that you're using words that will make sense to those students, that you're using language that's not only going to make sense to the students, but it's actually going to be effective with them. It's the difference, I refer back to coaching a lot, but it's the difference in coaching between knowing the athlete that's going to get better because you're yelling at them and pushing them along, and the one that if you're yelling at them, they're just going to curl up into a shell and crumple. And knowing the difference in your students, making sure that the format and the way you give that feedback is going to be useful and helpful in making them better science students. Most important thing is to remember that the goal of evaluating scientific learning is to make your students better science students, to make them better scientists. It's not to tell them how good they are. It's not even to give them a grade. It's to make them a better science student.